The morning of March 10th, 2019 began like any other, until the sky over Ethiopia tore open and the world's most trusted aviation brand faced a nightmare it could no longer outrun. In a single violent moment, a brand new Boeing 737 MAX slammed into a patch of farmland outside Addis Ababa with such force that it buried itself deep into the earth. There were 157 people on board. There were 0 survivors. For many Americans, Boeing had always been a symbol of excellence, an engineering powerhouse, a national champion, a company we associated with moon missions, transcontinental travel, and the safe, familiar roar of jet engines overhead. Generations believed Boeing jets were the safest machines ever built by human hands. But that Sunday morning would become the moment everything changed. The first hours after the crash were chaos, conflicting news reports, confusion at airports, desperate relatives calling phone lines that rang and rang without answer. But one truth emerged quickly. This tragedy was not isolated. Less than 5 months earlier, another Boeing 737 MAX had plunged into the sea off Indonesia, Lion Air Flight 610, killing 189 people. Now, two nearly identical catastrophes stood only 133 days apart, and the gut-wrenching questions swept across the globe. What if these weren't accidents? Families of the Ethiopian victims came from 35 different countries. Entire communities were shattered. A German family lost both parents. A Kenyan mother waited for children who would never arrive. In Canada, 3 generations traveling together were wiped out in an instant. The human toll was almost too vast to comprehend. Among the passengers was 28-year-old Marie Philipp, a young humanitarian worker from Germany traveling to a UN meeting in Nairobi. Her mother remembered the last ordinary minutes before the call arrived, the calm before a lifetime of grief. Marie's partner called, his voice breaking, unable to form words. When he finally did, he said the unthinkable. Marie had been on that plane. She had boarded it in the early morning, carrying nothing but a work folder, her optimism, and a mission to make the world better. And then she was gone. Another victim, Yasser Issa, left behind a wife and 3 daughters, who still keep his shoes near the door because it feels too painful to move them. The Njoroge family lost 3 young children, siblings whose empty bedrooms became monuments to a future stolen. The scale of grief was staggering, and yet, behind closed doors, aviation experts felt something even darker. This disaster might have been preventable. Only hours after the Ethiopian crash, investigators noticed disturbing similarities to the Lion Air disaster. Both planes were nearly new. Both crashed minutes after takeoff. Both struggled with erratic nose-down movements. And both pilots fought desperately to pull their aircraft out of a dive that seemed to have a mind of its own. A pattern was emerging, a terrifying one. And families demanded answers. How could the same brand new aircraft model suffer 2 catastrophic failures? Had Boeing known something and chosen not to speak? At memorials in Addis Ababa and Nairobi, photos of victims lined long tables draped with white cloth. Parents knelt before framed pictures of their children. Workers cleared space for hundreds of candles. It became clear to survivors' families that they were not looking at isolated tragedies. They were looking at a systemic failure. As forensic teams sifted through the crash site in Ethiopia, heavy machinery was needed to reach the deepest fragments. The jet had hit the ground at nearly 700 miles per hour. Its remains were so compacted that investigators compared it to a crater, rather than a debris field. Luggage, clothing, passports, and pieces of the fuselage blended into the earth as if swallowed whole. But what haunted aviation experts most was something else entirely. The crews never stood a chance. Both sets of pilots were fighting a force built directly into the aircraft itself. In the days after the crash, attention turned not only to the wreckage but to the corporate halls of Chicago and Seattle, where Boeing executives were scrambling to calm the world. The message was clear and repeated. The plane was safe, but the public no longer believed them. By mid-March, regulators across the globe began grounding the 737 MAX. China moved first, followed by Europe. The United States, despite being Boeing's home country, hesitated until public pressure became overwhelming. The FAA finally grounded the MAX on March 13th, one day after President Trump publicly endorsed the decision. That was the moment the dam broke. Suddenly, the world's most respected aviation company stood accused of designing a jet with a deadly flaw, failing to disclose it to pilots, and allowing 2 plane loads of men, women, and children to pay for that omission with their lives. For families, grounding the aircraft was not enough. They wanted a deeper truth. They wanted to know why these people died. Was it a faulty sensor, a software glitch, pilot error, Or was it something far more alarming, a design decision driven by competition, cost saving, or corporate pressure? Relatives traveled to Washington, Addis Ababa, Jakarta, Ottawa, and Nairobi demanding answers. They held hearings, gave testimony, carried photos of loved ones into congressional chambers, and stood before microphones shaking with grief and fury. What they sought was not revenge. It was accountability. It was assurance that no other family would endure what they had. The first clues began emerging from inside Boeing and the FAA. Investigators discovered that the company had been aware of issues tied to the 737 MAX long before Ethiopian Airlines 302 fell from the sky. FAA analysts had even calculated that, unless changes were made, the aircraft could experience catastrophic failures approximately every 2 or 3 years. That analysis was completed months before the second crash. For many Americans, especially those who grew up trusting Boeing as a national treasure, that revelation felt like a betrayal. Air travel is built on trust. Trust in engineers, trust in regulators, trust in systems designed to be fail-proof. And here was evidence suggesting that trust had been broken. As the wreckage cooled in Ethiopia, as families buried empty coffins, and as the aviation industry reeled, one thing became painfully clear. The story of the Boeing 737 MX was not simply about two crashes. It was about a system that failed at every level, from boardrooms to regulators to cockpit training. ChatGPT's Kazal, the race that set everything in motion, began long before the world ever heard the acronym MCAS. In 2010, Airbus unveiled the A320neo, a fuel-efficient upgrade that promised airlines millions in savings. Orders poured in at a historic pace. Overnight, Boeing's most profitable workhorse, the 737, looked outdated. To keep up, Boeing needed a response, fast. But instead of designing a new aircraft, they chose a shortcut. Re-engineer the existing 737 airframe, stretch its limits, bolt on larger engines, and sell it as a minimal training upgrade. That decision created a chain reaction that would end in tragedy. The new engines were bigger and mounted farther forward and higher than ever before. This altered the aircraft's aerodynamics. Under certain conditions, high thrust, steep angles, the nose could rise too aggressively, risking a stall. Boeing faced a brutal dilemma. They could redesign the airplane completely, a process costing billions and taking years. Or they could mask the new handling characteristics with software and present the MAX as just another 737 that pilots already knew. The company chose software. This is where MCAS, the maneuvering characteristics augmentation system, entered the picture. On paper, it sounded harmless. A small tweak, a background helper that gently nudged the nose downward to maintain stability during extreme maneuvers. But the reality was far from gentle. MCAS relied on a single sensor, an angle of attack vane, whose failure could send the system into a deadly loop. If that sensor misread the angle, MCAS could activate repeatedly, forcing the nose downward again and again, even if pilots pulled back with all their strength. Inside Boeing, the push to hide MCAS from pilots became explicit. Emails show employees joking about using a Jedi mind trick to convince airlines and regulators that simulator training wasn't necessary. Training, after all, cost money. If pilots needed a simulator, airlines might choose Airbus instead. One Boeing manager bragged in a message that he had convinced regulators to drop simulator requirements. "I'll do anything to avoid sim training." The goal was simple: maintain the illusion that the MAX flew just like the previous 737. So MCAS was quietly embedded into the aircraft without full disclosure. It was not included in pilot manuals. It was not highlighted during training. Many pilots had never even heard of the system that would one day overpower their aircraft. When Lion Air Flight 610 crashed in October 2018, the first clues appeared. Investigators found that MCAS had activated repeatedly, pushing the nose down even as the pilots fought desperately to climb. The cockpit voice recorder captured the chaos, warnings blaring, altitude dropping, alarms screaming. Yet even then, Boeing downplayed the significance of MCAS. They issued brief bulletins, but avoided any admission that the system could cause loss of control. Then came the second blow. 5 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 lifted off the runway and immediately began fighting the same unseen enemy. Within seconds, the aircraft started pitching erratically. MCAS activation recorded on the flight data showed the stabilizer trimming nose down with increasing force. The pilots pulled back hard, trying to override the automatic commands. They flipped through checklists, attempted emergency procedures, and tried to disable the system. But unlike Boeing's assurances, it wasn't easy. When MCAS triggered at low altitude with high speed, the forces were overwhelming. The pilots had only minutes. Why didn't Boeing tell the world the truth after the first crash? The answer, as investigations later suggested, was financial. The MAX program was worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Grounding the aircraft after just one crash might have shattered trust, slowed production, and led airlines to cancel orders. The company bet that Lion Air was an isolated tragedy, perhaps caused by maintenance issues or pilot error. They gambled that the system wouldn't fail again. MKS wasn't just a flawed piece of software, it was a symptom of a deeper issue, a company that had shifted from engineering-led to finance-driven. Insiders described immense pressure to minimize delays, avoid regulatory scrutiny, and protect sales commitments. In internal meetings, discussing MCAS too openly could threaten the narrative that the MAX was simply an upgrade, not a redesigned aircraft requiring rigorous certification. As documents later revealed, engineers at Boeing warned about the dangers of MCAS long before the crashes. Some raised concerns about relying on a single sensor. Others questioned the decision to hide the system entirely, but their voices were either ignored, minimized, or overshadowed by commercial urgency. Meanwhile, FAA oversight had grown increasingly reliant on Boeing's own assessments. Tasks that once belonged to regulators were delegated back to the manufacturer itself. The watchdog had fallen asleep, and the company it was supposed to monitor became its guide. After the Ethiopian crash, the truth began to surface. FAA risk models, created after the Lion Air disaster, estimated that if MKS remained unchanged, up to 15 more deadly crashes could occur over the life of the fleet. That analysis existed months before the second tragedy, yet the MAX continued flying. MCAS was only supposed to activate under rare conditions, but in reality, a single faulty sensor could unleash it at any moment. Pilots were never trained to recognize the runaway trim patterns unique to MCAS. They were never instructed how to disable the system quickly under extreme pressure. Many pilots did not even know the system existed. An entire generation of aviators placed trust in a machine that carried a secret, one capable of turning routine takeoffs into fatal, unrecoverable spirals. By the time the world learned the truth, 346 people were dead. Families believed Boeing had gambled with human life. Pilots around the world questioned what else had been hidden from them. And passengers, many of whom grew up flying Boeing jets without a second thought, began wondering whether the company still valued safety above profit. MCAS was more than a failed system. It was a symbol, a warning, a story of what happens when a company chases market share at the expense of transparency, when software becomes a bandage over structural problems, and when a trusted brand forgets that every algorithm, every bolt, every line of code must honor the lives it carries. And as the investigation deepened, one question became unavoidable. How could a company with Boeing's legacy allow such a system to exist in the first place? The collapse of trust between Boeing and the flying public did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, hidden within the quiet halls of America's most powerful aviation authority, the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. For decades, the FAA had been regarded as the gold standard of oversight, the guardian of air safety, the agency the world looked to for leadership. But by the time the 737 MAX entered service, something fundamental had changed. Regulators were no longer the tough watchdogs they once were. Increasingly, they had become partners, and in some cases dependents, of the very companies they were meant to oversee. When the Lion Air crash occurred in October 2018, industry insiders expected the FAA to step in forcefully. A brand new jet had plunged into the sea minutes after takeoff. That alone should have triggered a full review of its design and systems. But instead of grounding the MAX, the FAA waited. And while it waited, the aircraft kept flying, with the same flawed software, the same vulnerabilities, and the same hidden dangers that pilots had not been trained to handle. Behind the scenes, FAA engineers were worried. They ran internal risk models that predicted something almost unimaginable. If the 737 MAX continued to operate without changes, another catastrophic accident was likely, perhaps even inevitable. Their analysis estimated that as many as 15 similar crashes could occur over the projected lifespan of the fleet. These findings should have set off alarms at every level of leadership. Instead, it languished in internal documents, overshadowed by Boeing's reassurances and the political pressure to keep the MAX in the skies. Why didn't the FAA act? The answer, uncovered in congressional hearings and investigative reports, pointed to a structural shift that had been quietly taking place for years. In an effort to streamline certification and reduce government costs, more and more authority had been delegated back to manufacturers. Boeing employees, engineers whose paychecks came from the company, were given the power to sign off on safety assessments. The FAA, stretched thin and underfunded, increasingly relied on the company's own evaluations. This system, known as Organization Designation Authorization, blurred the line between regulator and regulated. In theory, it was meant to increase efficiency. In practice, it allowed Boeing to police itself. When investigators later reviewed the certification of the MAX, they discovered that critical systems, including MCAS, had been classified as non-hazardous, meaning they required less scrutiny. The FAA had not independently examined the logic of the software. It hadn't required full transparency about the system's potential authority over the aircraft. And it hadn't evaluated what would happen if the single sensor feeding MCAS failed. In short, the FAA signed off on a system it didn't fully understand. Across the Atlantic, the European Union's Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, was following its own certification process. But even there, cooperation agreements meant that Europe often relied on American evaluations for American-built aircraft. When Boeing designated MCAS as non-critical, and when the FAA accepted that classification, the Europeans accepted it too. It wasn't until after the Ethiopian crash that EASA realized it had overlooked a system that could take full control of the aircraft without pilot input. In an interview months later, EASA officials admitted that they had never reviewed MCAS directly because Boeing had assured them it was insignificant. The agency later paused the entire delegation model, insisting that in the future, all major flight control systems on Boeing aircraft would undergo their own independent testing. But these changes came only after 346 lives were lost. In Washington, the FAA's slow response after the second crash was seen by many as the clearest sign of a broken system. Countries around the world grounded the MAX, China first, then Europe, Australia, Canada, and dozens more. The United States held out until the very end. Only after mounting political pressure, damning satellite data, and widespread public backlash did the FAA finally follow suit. It was a moment that marked the erosion of American leadership in aviation safety, a role it had held for generations. Then came the discovery that Boeing had withheld crucial documents from the FAA for months. The agency's administrator issued a sharply worded letter demanding answers, an extraordinary move that exposed the tension between the regulator and the manufacturer. These documents included internal messages that showed Boeing employees had mocked the FAA, boasted about manipulating regulators, and expressed concerns about the safety of the MAX long before it entered service. Congressional hearings further revealed a culture of coziness between Boeing and the FAA. Closed-door meetings, phone calls between executives and regulators, and a long history of revolving-door employment. It wasn't corruption in the traditional sense. It was something more subtle and more dangerous. Institutional complacency. A belief that Boeing, with its proud history, could be trusted implicitly. That a company of such stature would never cut corners. That a tragedy on the scale of Lion Air could never happen again. But it did. And when it did, the world saw the consequence of a system where oversight had grown too comfortable, too trusting, too aligned with the industry it was supposed to monitor. The FAA found itself criticized, not only abroad but within the United States, by pilots, lawmakers, engineers, and even its own former employees. Meanwhile, the European EASA, once content to rely on American certifications, began distancing itself. It insisted on running its own tests before the MAX could return to Europe's skies. It demanded simulator training for pilots, a step Boeing had fought to avoid. And it pledged to overhaul its processes to ensure no manufacturer could ever again hide critical systems behind vague classification. The cracks in the certification system were now exposed for the world to see: a flawed regulatory framework, a dangerous dependence on manufacturer data, and a culture that prioritized efficiency over thoroughness. And at the center of it all stood MCAS, a tiny piece of software that became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. By the time the dust settled, the FAA's reputation had been deeply shaken. The trust that once defined American aviation oversight had fractured. And for the families of the victims, the realization was devastating. The people who were supposed to protect them had failed. The stage was set for a reckoning, not just for Boeing, but for the entire system that allowed the MAX to fly at all. Inside Boeing's sprawling factories, long before the world learned the name MCAS, something had already begun to go wrong. It wasn't a single decision or one reckless manager. It was a slow erosion of a culture once defined by engineering excellence and relentless safety. And no one understood this better than the workers who lived inside those walls, watching the company they had dedicated decades to gradually drift toward a dangerous new identity. For years, Boeing had been known as a place where engineers held authority. A place where if a mechanic said a part wasn't safe, production stopped, no questions asked. But as competition with Airbus intensified and financial targets grew more aggressive, that culture shifted. Deadlines tightened, production quotas rose, and people on the factory floor began to feel a new kind of pressure, one that discouraged raising concerns and rewarded silence. At the company's facility in Charleston, South Carolina, one of the major assembly sites for the 787 Dreamliner, employees noticed a series of unsettling patterns. Non-conforming parts began disappearing from tracking systems. Components that failed inspection weren't scrapped or repaired, they simply couldn't be found. One quality manager documented hundreds of defect reports, creating spreadsheets and handwritten notes on aircraft that left the factory with serious unresolved issues. But when he tried to escalate the concerns, he was told by his director, "I don't want any more of these papers. Don't send me another picture." He persisted. He warned that safety was at risk, that passengers could die. Weeks later, he was removed from his position, reassigned, and ultimately pushed out of the company entirely. Another engineer described finding metal shavings, sharp splinters from drilled holes, scattered around crucial wiring harnesses inside the Dreamliner. Over time, those fragments could embed themselves into insulation, cut into wires, and cause short circuits. He reported the issue. Instead of addressing the underlying problem, Boeing replaced him with a less experienced manager, who, according to him, simply waved the problem away. Over 800 aircraft, he said, were delivered with those shavings still inside. There were the oxygen systems too, vital components designed to keep passengers alive at 40,000 feet in the event of decompression. Workers tested them and found that 1 in 4 didn't function properly. 25% failure rate. The discovery horrified them. But when they raised the alarm, the response they received was procedural, bureaucratic, and ultimately dismissive. Boeing said the supplier would address the issue through the normal FAA-approved process. Meanwhile, planes continued rolling out the door. Then there was Cynthia, a quality inspector who carried her camera everywhere on the factory floor. She photographed bolts tightened with the wrong tools, cracked components, improperly installed fasteners, wiring damage during assembly. She tried to report these issues, believing deeply in the Boeing she had joined decades earlier. But instead of being thanked, she was targeted, harassed, bullied. One manager, according to her account, pinned her against a railing and warned her to get on the good old boy system, or her career wouldn't survive. 3 weeks later, that same manager was placed in charge of her performance reviews. Workers described a schedule that became impossible to sustain. A decade earlier, building a single aircraft moved in 3-week intervals. Over time, the schedule tightened until the same volume of work had to be completed in just 3 days. The number of mechanics did not increase. In some cases, staffing was reduced. The pressure to push it out the door became overwhelming. And it wasn't only employees in Charleston. Across multiple Boeing sites, workers came forward with similar stories. Fear of retaliation, managers discouraging defect reports, and a corporate culture where speaking up meant risking your job. Some described an internal joke, grim but revealing. They called it quality at the speed of cash. Many of these accounts eventually reached the FAA, but even that avenue offered little relief. Some employees said they reported defects, only to have regulators handle it internally with Boeing, never informing them of the outcome. Others described meetings where FAA representatives seemed more aligned with Boeing than with the workers raising concerns. One experienced engineer made the decision to bypass the FAA entirely and bring his concerns directly to Europe's aviation regulator, EASA. His case involved production issues on the 787 Dreamliner, non-conforming parts, questionable documentation, and repeated deviations from design standards. He hoped an outside authority might take the issue more seriously, but EASA officials later admitted that they had limited jurisdiction. They could not inspect Boeing's US factories. They could only notify the FAA and hope action would follow. Behind closed doors, the people building Boeing's aircraft felt the weight of responsibility. They knew that every bolt, every wire, every sensor represented human lives. Many had spent years in the company, proud of its history, proud of what Boeing meant to America. And now they watched with growing fear as shortcuts became routine, and voices of caution were pushed aside. The internal emails that surfaced after the crashes only confirmed what these workers already knew. In one, an employee wrote bluntly, "We picked the lowest cost supplier." In another, "It's systemic, it's culture." And in a particularly damning message, a Boeing pilot involved in MAX testing said the aircraft was designed by clowns supervised by monkeys. These were not isolated complaints. They were signals of a deep cultural fracture, a shift from engineering discipline to financial obsession, a shift that allowed MCAS to pass unnoticed, a shift that let known defects slip through, a shift that turned Boeing's factories into places where employees whispered their fears rather than voiced them. For those who dared to speak up, the cost was often high: stalled careers, reassignments, intimidation, or termination. But the greater cost was still to come, because as the world soon realized, when the culture inside Boeing broke, the safety of its airplanes broke with it, and the consequences would echo far beyond factory walls, into the skies above, into congressional hearings, into the homes of grieving families, and into the future of aviation itself. In the decades before the MAX crisis, Boeing was more than a company. It was an American institution. It built the jets that carried soldiers home from war, that connected cities across continents, that helped create the very idea of modern air travel. For millions of Americans, especially those over 45, Boeing represented the era when engineering excellence defined national pride. The people who worked there wore Boeing jackets like badges of honor, and the aircraft they built were symbols of an America that could out-innovate anyone. But by the early 2000s, that Boeing had begun to fade. What replaced it would set the stage for the greatest corporate failure in aviation history. The turning point came in 1997, when Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas. At the time, it was celebrated as a marriage of aerospace giants, a union that would strengthen America's global leadership. But inside the company, many engineers believed something very different had happened. McDonnell Douglas didn't merge with Boeing, they joked bitterly. It took it over. McDonnell Douglas had been a company driven by cost discipline, financial controls, and shareholder demands. Boeing historically was driven by engineering obsessiveness, people who argued over rivets, airflow, and stress tolerances. After the merger, former McDonnell Douglas executives rose to power inside Boeing's leadership. They brought a new philosophy. Airplanes were no longer primarily engineering achievements, they were financial products. That shift may sound subtle, but in aviation it is seismic. Employees who lived through the transition described an atmosphere that gradually became more corporate, more political, and more hostile toward anyone who slowed down production. Meetings shifted from discussions about safety margins to discussions about quarterly targets. Business school vocabulary replaced engineering vocabulary. Share price became the scorecard. And in this new Boeing, time was money, and time spent on redesigns, delays, or rigorous testing was seen as inefficiency. This cultural evolution collided head-on with a global industry that had begun to change as well. Low-cost carriers were rising fast, placing enormous pressure on aircraft manufacturers to cut operating costs. Airbus surged ahead with modern designs that promised fuel savings. Airlines shopped not only for safety and performance, but for economics. Fewer training hours, lower maintenance, more seats packed into the same airframe. When Airbus announced its A320neo in 2010, ordering numbers exploded so quickly that Boeing executives saw something they had never experienced before: panic. Airbus had created an aircraft that was cheaper to fly and didn't require pilots to learn a new platform. It was a direct shot at Boeing's most profitable market. Inside Boeing's boardroom, the decision should have been obvious: design a new airplane. Engineers pleaded for it, but a new jet would cost billions, delay profits, and require airlines to buy new simulators. Instead, Boeing's leaders chose the path that aligned with financial incentives: rework the old 737 one more time. And thus, the MAX was born, not from innovation, but from competitive desperation. The MAX was marketed as a simple upgrade. Boeing promised airlines they wouldn't need to retrain pilots, wouldn't need simulators, wouldn't need to change procedures. It was a strategy that saved customers millions and helped Boeing close lucrative sales. But the commitment boxed the company into a corner. To uphold the no new training guarantee, Boeing had to make the MAX behave like older 737s, even though its new engines made that impossible. So they created MCAS, and then they hid it. The hiding was not a single decision. It was the culmination of a culture that valued sales over transparency. Pilots were never told the system existed because admitting it existed would require training. Regulators weren't fully briefed because raising its profile would require deeper scrutiny. Airlines were reassured that the MAX was the same because Boeing feared losing the price war with Airbus. When the MAX began flying, success appeared guaranteed. Orders exceeded $600 billion. The stock soared. Executives collected bonuses. Wall Street praised the company as a model of American efficiency. Then Lion Air Flight 610 fell into the sea. The tragedy should have shaken Boeing's leadership to the core. It should have triggered an immediate grounding. It should have sent investigators into every corner of the MAX program. Instead, Boeing defended the aircraft, shifted blame to maintenance and pilot error, and insisted the MAX was safe. It asked regulators to trust it, and regulators did. That trust cost 157 more lives 5 months later. After the Ethiopian crash, Boeing's public image collapsed almost overnight. For the first time in its history, nations around the world grounded a Boeing aircraft before the United States did. The FAA's hesitation shattered its reputation as the global leader in aviation oversight. Congress held multiple hearings. Boeing executives testified, apologizing publicly but revealing little. The CEO resigned under pressure. The financial consequences were staggering. Boeing halted MAX production for the first time in decades. Billions evaporated in losses. The stock price tumbled. Airlines demanded compensation. Lawsuits mounted. Workers faced furloughs. The company's future seemed uncertain in a way no one had imagined possible. Yet the deeper consequence was not financial. It was moral. Families of the victims organized, traveled the world, spoke before lawmakers, and fought to prevent their loved ones from becoming statistics. Their grief filled hearing rooms, international summits, and news broadcasts. They challenged Boeing, the FAA, and the global aviation industry. They forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths. How could a company with such a proud legacy fail so catastrophically? How could regulators entrusted with safety become so entangled with the manufacturer they oversaw? How could warnings from engineers and workers have been ignored? These families argued that the tragedies were not the result of two faulty flights, but the result of a broken system, one that gave too much power to manufacturers, too little independence to regulators, and too much weight to financial pressure. In response, the world's aviation regulators, especially ESA, began asserting unprecedented independence. They conducted their own tests, demanded simulator training for pilots, required hardware changes, and insisted on full transparency. The FAA underwent internal reform, re-examining the delegation system that had allowed Boeing to self-certify critical functions. Inside Boeing, employees began speaking more openly. The company launched internal reviews. Longtime engineers called for a return to an older Boeing philosophy, one that valued craftsmanship, caution, and engineering rigor over quarterly results. Some executives acknowledged that the company had lost its way. Others admitted that the MAX crisis would shape Boeing for decades. And yet, for many observers, the question remains, can Boeing regain the trust it once had? The answer is not simple. Trust, once broken, rebuilds slowly, especially when lives have been lost. But the aviation industry has faced crises before, and each time, hard lessons reshaped safety standards worldwide. The MAX tragedy forced a reckoning unlike any in modern aviation. It exposed the cost of complacency, the danger of corporate shortcuts, and the fragility of oversight systems built on outdated assumptions. Today, the families of the victims continue to push for change. They attend hearings. They monitor reforms. They remind the world that safety is not a corporate slogan. It is a commitment paid for with human lives. Their message is clear. The 346 people who died must not be forgotten. Their deaths must mean something. Their loss must prevent future loss. In the end, the story of the Boeing 737 MAX is not only a story of engineering failure or regulatory collapse. It is the story of how one of America's greatest companies lost its identity and the long, painful struggle to reclaim it. It is a warning about what happens when profit outruns principle. And it is a reminder that in aviation, every decision reverberates far beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. Because in the sky, there are no second chances. And safety, real, uncompromising safety, is the only thing that keeps the world aloft.